I was in the dean's office at Dartmouth Medical School for forever. They called me the heart and soul of Dartmouth Medical School. My business was trying to get students to do service-related things in the community, working with underserved populations, and in using literature and the arts and humanities to actually help people reflect on what they were doing. But that's aside, and if I have a little chance at the end, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But what I wanted to talk to you about is some ideas I had as you were talking, about what you were doing. And the first is to tell you about a colleague whose name is Jack Wenberg at Dartmouth. And Jack Wenberg was a Vermont guy, and as his kids were growing up, and one day was riding up on the ski lift with a couple of his kids, he began to talk to his kids and his kids' friends about who was getting tonsillectomies. And it was amazing, he said, that kids from one town, virtually every kid had a tonsillectomy. From another town, they didn't, or other towns. And so he began to study this, as why was there such a variation in healthcare? And he just developed this whole set of research that's called small area variation. And what he found out is that the decision to get a tonsillectomy was not entirely related to the medical indications from getting a tonsillectomy, but it was related to the practice of that particular area. And wow. So again, what I said the other day, that what he ended up discovering that the most important thing in terms of you getting your health care was your zip code, where you lived. He went on to study cesarean sections. Again, there's huge variations throughout the country in people who get cesarean sections. It wasn't because what are the exact indications for cesarean sections. It was because of the local practices. And when Mrs. Clinton was trying to do the healthcare plan many years ago, she came to Dartmouth and studied Jack's work about these small area variations and how could you learn from them. And the health plan didn't go that she was trying to push. But what came out of that was what's called the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare. And what they did is they took the Medicare database for all the conditions you can imagine and looked at the variations of care throughout the nations. And it varied by a great deal. It's interesting that both the incident, the use of cardiac bypass in Boston was different than New Haven. The length of stay in the hospital was different. The same condition. Why? The cost to the patients was different. Why was that? So anyhow, this Dartmouth Atlas has had a huge impact in terms of looking at what can we learn from this? Why is there such variation? And as I was thinking of you guys and what you're doing, I see the variations between communities. And again, how did Jack use that? So a couple of anecdotes. The cardiac surgeons at my institution, they were upset because they didn't think they were getting enough reimbursement from Medicare for the procedures they were doing. That was their initial sort of impetus to study cardiac surgery. And so they formed this consortium of cardiac surgeons in northern New England at all the hospitals that did cardiac surgery in northern New England. They called it the Northern New England Cardiovascular Disease Studies Group. And what they found out, at every institution, there was a different sort of incidence of people getting cardiac surgery and different outcomes. And not only at every institution, but within institutions, specific surgeons have different rates of doing and outcomes of doing cardiac surgery. And those that had not so good outcomes would say, oh, I took all the difficult patients. But when you looked at the data, they didn't. There was no difference from the patients they were getting. There was difference in outcomes. And what could they do with that difference in outcomes? And what they decided to do was study it. And so they looked at the process of getting cardiac surgery in the various hospitals in New England. Those surgeons who weren't getting such good outcomes, some surgeons that were having great outcomes would come and scrub with them in the operating room. They'd learn new techniques. And actually what happened because of this whole study group was the water for all the boats got raised. And now, actually, New England is the safest place to get cardiac surgery in the world right now because they've studied it, and they studied these variations. And as I was thinking about the difference between Casablanca and Fez and the difference within the places in Tanzania, I was thinking of Wenberg's work in this whole small area variation. I mentioned an outcome of that is some of the parents with kids with cystic fibrosis began to learn about cystic fibrosis care. And a kid with cystic fibrosis with the same level of disease who comes into a hospital in one part of the country has a different outcome from a kid in another part of the country. So the moms and dads were saying, why don't we all figure out what the best care is, and everybody try to do that. And so a cystic fibrosis study group is going on right now where they're raising the water for all the boats. Again, thinking about the cervical cancer screening or the breast cancer screening or the hepatitis, the HIV hepatitis, hepatoma work in the various countries. Can you learn from the various centers with all the data that you've got? What's the best way to do things? What's the correct way to do things? Because it varies very widely, and it's local practices that are really important. Now, the second person who came to, Jack Wenberg founded something called the Dartmouth Institute for Advocacy and Health Policy is an MPH program there, and there studies these small area variations. But the other thing they began to study was improvement science. And a guy named Paul Batalden came to join us, and he was one of the founders of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And so what we've been doing is thinking about improvement. And again, thinking about your projects, improvement, what it does is says, what's the goal? The goal is to have the best breast cancer screening we can have in Tanzania for a reason by a certain date. And how do you know you get there? You do an evaluation second. So the first thing is to write a goal, and then you do an evaluation. And then what you do is look at the process. So you might take one patient with, say, cervical cancer and look at her, journey through the system. And, what happens? And can you improve? There are process improvements and outcome improvement, but there's little things you can do. So to make that variation that happens with each patient the best possible thing. And then you can do small tests of change, Can you say, gee, if they have cell phones, if we call her on the night before she's supposed to come into the clinic visit, is it more likely she comes in and gets the thing done? Is it more likely when the pathologist gets the specimen, in some way versus another way? You can do small tests of change. And as you go up the ladder doing small tests of change, plan, do, study, act, you can come to a point where, yes, we have the best cervical cancer screening right now in Tanzania. And actually what's happening in Tanzania applies to Morocco, to other areas too. How can you take the best of the best and learn to do improvement science? I think what Joan was just talking about was improvement science. How can we get people walking? What are the plan, do, study, act things to get more people walking? The evaluation is how many people are walking, and blah, blah, blah. So that lesson from my colleagues about small area variations, the zip code is the most thing that you can learn from these variations. What is best practices? How can you raise the water for all the boats in the places you're studying? And you have tremendous data to be able to do that. You have tremendous data to be able to come together and say, you can improve the health plan, the plan for dealing with cervical cancer, with breast cancer, with hepatoma, with whatever, in those communities you serve. Here are some things that would be suggested to do. And one strategy for that I think is a useful strategy is something called appreciative inquiry. I was mentioning that to other people. Has anybody heard of appreciative inquiry? It's a strength-based approach. It was actually developed in the Case Western Business School by a guy named David Cooperrider. But what he says is, the first thing he says, within every system, no matter how dysfunctional it is, there's something that works. And if you find out if that something works, then you can expand it and try and do more with it. So the first thing is to discover, to sort of say, within Tanzania in their cervical cancer screening, what is it that's really working? What is it? And there's something there, and try and grow that bigger. And the second part is called dreaming of appreciative inquiry. Discover what's there, dream about what could be. And that question I asked about, supposing you were Rip Van Winkle and went to sleep and woke up and went back to Tanzania, and it was the perfect system for screening for cervical cancer, what would it look like? And people can become really creative with that. And once you've discovered what's there, dreamed about what could be, then you design, and the fourth stage is deliver it. So the 4 Ds, and something called appreciative inquiry, and David Cooperrider is an important person there. So the third thing I wanted to just mention, the first was small area variation, Jack Wenberg, improvement science. The second is using appreciative inquiry to make change. The third is a fellow named Howard Gardner at Harvard School of Education has studied people, he has found out that people have multiple intelligences, and some people are cognitively intelligent, and some people are musically intelligent, and some people are physically intelligent, some people are emotionally intelligent. Anyhow, there's a whole different ways. And he started to study how people got good at these things. How did elite pianists get good at being elite pianists? How did elite biochemists get good at being elite biochemists? How did elite figure skaters? And so he's been studying these things. And he began to study how people got good at being good. And he called this good work. And he had a number of insights about this. Good work he defined as it was excellent. It met the expert test. That's what you're doing. You do excellent work, meets the expert test. It was responsible. It meets the mirror test. When you get up in the morning and look in the mirror, you feel pretty good about what you're doing. And it was also meaningful. It got you something he and one of his co-authors called flow. And flow is a state, you feel what you're doing is really good. It gives meaning and purpose in your life. It happens at work more than any place else, is what he said. When your skills and the tasks are consonant, it's a good feeling, and it brings you back. And we fail to notice it sometimes. But flow happens at work a lot. Flow has happened in your projects a lot. And when a person has high skills and is given a low task, they may get bored. And when people have low skills and get a high task, they may get anxious. But when their task and the skills are resonant, they have this flow feeling. And so notice those feelings, and when you start to notice them and notice meaning and purpose in your work, it actually brings you back more. It's actually good for your health. There's a lot of good things about flow. But the reason I mention this whole business about Howard Gardner and good work is that this group has the characteristics of an organization that produces good work, and what Howard Gardner found. And those characteristics are what he called vertical support, mentors helping you, maybe you're mentoring somebody else, so vertical support, and then horizontal, a peer support, which you have, vertical support, horizontal support. But the third component that he found was crucial to doing good work was periods of renewal. This is a period of renewal, periods of joy, of celebration of what you're doing. And so all of those things can help you produce good work. So not what I had planned to say originally about myself and some things in my own life, but if you remember, think about small area variation and how can you get the best practices to be the best practices everywhere, and what can you do improvement science. Appreciative inquiry may be a way to do that, and think about doing good work, excellent, responsible, meaningful, which has vertical support, horizontal support, and periods of renewal. So thanks. Any questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any resources for us to learn more about appreciative inquiry and
Yeah.
implementation science, because we are epidemiologists or in community health and
Yeah.
house.
Well, if you Google appreciative inquiry and David Cooper-Ryder, there are wonderful books on that, you know. Who has used it extensively is the Indiana School of Medicine. And in their discovery phase, they went around and asked groups, what do you love about Indiana School of Medicine, to the students? And people would say, are you kidding me? Nobody's ever asked me that. But what they would do is they'd find out all these things that people loved about it, and then they'd have these public things, and people would come up, and there were all these themes. This is what we love about it. And then they said, supposing, you know, we had the best school, what would it be like? What would the environment be like in the dream phase? And they did this thing where they came up with this unbelievable thing. Then they started implementing it and doing things that made this culture, this culture change. It's the most supportive and relationship-oriented medical school that's really changed its culture. There's something called a hidden curriculum. You know, there's the curriculum, and then there's the institutional culture, which is the hidden curriculum. It's what we do rather than what we say, you know. And they've changed the hidden curriculum a great deal, so it's resonant with the formal curriculum, and you know, and actually that's tremendously conducive to effective learning. And meaning and purpose and health and a whole bunch of things that they've been able to do. But David Cooper-Ryder, Appreciative Inquiry, Google it, there's plenty of books. Or write me, I can give you reams of stuff on Appreciative Inquiry.
Dr. O'Donnell, we have new medical students here, so I'll ask you the question that I asked you yesterday. And maybe you can elaborate more from your experience as the Senior Associate Chief for Education at Dartmouth. What's your evaluation of training of medical students in foreign countries, not public health students, but medical students? Things
Of our medical students going to foreign countries?
Yeah, you felt worked well, things that need to be considered for the future, for improvement that we need to consider here.
Yeah. Well, there's several things that I've learned from our students going to foreign countries. And let me just say, a couple of years ago at a fourth year course we have with a small group, we had 8 students in the room, and I asked each one of them, what was the most important experience or the best experience you had at Dartmouth Medical School, at my medical school? And somebody said, when I was in Tanzania, when I was in Kosovo, and I, at the end of it, after talking to each other, I said, do we do anything at home? You know, and but it's what I think Dr. Dorn just said about you being able to set your own priorities, to be creative, to not having people telling you what to do, but to actually use your own inner values and desires to get done what you needed to do. There was something really important to that and learning from that. One of the other things I've really appreciated about our students going to foreign countries, we have so much technology here, and I'm a big advocate for physical diagnosis, for talking to people and physical exam and stuff like that rather than MRIs and stuff that might not be needed. And what they learn in countries that don't have readily available a lot of this stuff is how important that is. And that's an indelible lesson. When they come back, they are much more effective in using technology. And the other thing I think they learn is how many good people there are in the world, and how dedicated and interested in making things better people who they never even had met before are. And being immersed in another culture helps them being immersed in other cultures here too. And so I think, to me, it's a spectacular and important experience that helps you become a better, not only a better doctor, but a better person.
Other questions?